we're here to talk to you really about a study that we're undertaking in collaboration with Ouranos here in Canada about the impacts of virtual conferencing in the climate and sustainability field. So why are we undertaking a study like this? I think there's a few features that we would highlight. First of all, obviously, is the reality of the climate crisis and the need to dramatically reduce CO2 emissions that are linked to travel and to develop new collaborative solutions. So simultaneously reducing the number of miles that we travel whilst scaling up our ability to work together to come up with creative solutions to complex challenges like climate change. As we all know by now, the COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to develop new practices for virtual engagements, new ways of working, has had a steep learning curve for many of us in very complex kind of social circumstances simultaneously. There's a lot of lessons that are emerging from that, and we wanted to make sure that we captured some of those as we move forward into whatever normal awaits us to make sure that we're really learning from those. Thirdly, and I think very importantly and often overlooked, is the question of equity and inclusion that we want to really focus on today. And to ask ourselves, how do we make sure that as we shift towards new forms of virtual participation, virtual engagement, that we're keeping kind of equitable, particularly in terms of global north, global south, but more broadly around different intersectional forms of equity. We're keeping that equity at the center of the strategies that we're developing. And finally, there's an opportunity that's attached to this that I'll mention is that we are doing much of this in preparation for the 2023 Adaptation Futures Conference. Many of you in the room may have heard of Adaptation Futures. The last edition was offered in Delhi, India, which was had to be moved entirely online after much kind of many challenges related to scheduling and to the pandemic. And so we seized this opportunity in collaboration with partners at IDRC, and I'm glad to see Bruce Curry-Alder in the room, to really think hard about what the future of academic conferencing should look like really in 2023 and beyond, and to use that as a basis for designing the 2023 conference with some of those lessons in mind. And so what you're hearing from us today is really some of our initial thinking on this. We're at the early stages, and we'll explain to you what we've done to date, but really also to invite some of your ideas and some of your suggestions into this space so that it can feed some of the conversation that we'll be having in the in the days to come. So with that, I think I'll turn over to Arya, who will take us through the rest of the slides.
Explain. Also, I'm just going to put in the chat a Padlet. So this is a chance for you to let us know where you're coming from, where you're tuning in from, and we can check that out afterwards. So the guiding question for this presentation today is, how can we ensure that low carbon, climate, and sustainability conferences are just, inclusive, and impactful? And this is really a driving question for the larger project that we're doing as well. So some of the methods that we're using to answer this question. So we started with a scoping review of the literature, really focusing on since COVID-19 began in 2019. So there is a lot of information since then. There is a lot of interest on virtual conferencing. We also had a targeted survey. So we sent out a survey to people who typically attend academic conferences, and we got 166 responses from 49 countries. So we sent it out in both French and English. And 40% of these responses were from less developed countries. And we really tried to get a broad range of people. So from different career stages, professional roles, students, people who work in government as well. And from that review and the survey, we identified a couple conference case studies, Gobeshona being one of them. A few responses said that Gobeshona was a really great example, so that's why we're here today. And we want to look at hybrid, virtual, and multi-hub formats to really compare and contrast and see what we can learn. And this all goes to our design-driven action research. So we're hoping to involve conference attendees and conference stakeholders in the design and planning for Adaptation Futures in 2023 in Montreal. And we really want to take some lessons from the field and engage in a really exciting virtual conference. So a little outline for what we're going to do today. So we're going to start with the why. So why do we attend conferences, and have a little conversation about if virtual formats are actually more inclusive. Then we'll move on to the how. So how do you have a great conference? So what are our conferencing options, and what are some insights from our survey that we've learned? Then we'd like to hear from you. So we'll have a discussion, maybe using Padlet, but maybe just an open discussion since it's a small group today. And then we'll wrap up with looking ahead with what's next, and then some key takeaways from our presentation. So now I'm going to pass it on to Elaine.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today again. So I'm going to begin with some of the discussion from the literature, as well as some insights that we've got from the survey results. So, control. Yes. So the first question we're asking ourselves is actually, so if we're aware of the sort of impact of air travel, so why do academics still travel to attend conferences? And there are definitely a number of interrelated personal and structural reasons that we've got so far. Some of them are straightforward, some of them are less tricky. So for example, definitely the perceived benefit there, there are a lot of kind of like assumption, or actually probably true, probably we don't know, but a lot of like a common discussion around face-to-face interaction is actually being seen as a vital component and like essential for joint discovery, sort of like back and forth discussion, for example, to ensure research quality. And also it's being seen as essential to build trust and collaborative relationship. And a number of studies have shown that a lot of academics actually share this belief that attending international conference is a key component for their career advancement. However, there started have some like studies show the opposite of the results. For example, some of the studies show that actually there's very limited correlation between long distance conference travel and research impact. However, we want to note that these studies are actually largely based in global north. From our survey result, when we're asking our participants, and 40% of them are actually from less developed countries, and we actually found that around 31% of them share that attending conferences actually is essential or even mandatory at work, compared to only 15% of the respondents share the same kind of like results in developed countries. So these kind of like beg the question of when we're talking about, no, this is actually not related to career advancement, so let's move everything online. Is it actually going to impact some population that it's not really being voiced in the literature? And definitely there are a number of discussion even before the pandemic talking about how the internationalization of higher education actually lead to this perception or like general behavior of like more travel means good. So definitely this is related to the incentive structure in academia and how higher education institution actually sort of give this narrative of we want more global network, we want more international collaboration, and sort of like create this a structure that make academics and people who are in academia really feel the need to really push for more air traveling and to do more international collaborative work. In some areas, air mobility, meaning like the ability to air travel, is kind of being seen as a marker of success. So having international speakers, for example, can be seen as a kind of key factor to determine whether or not this is a prestigious event in some area. And definitely at the larger scale, at the system level, the transportation infrastructure of where a person is located definitely have a major impact on whether or not the person travel more often. There are just some society that you have to travel to go for international conferences compared to, for example, in Europe, things are more interrelated. The trend kind of structure is more advanced. So the study actually showed that social kind of norm and structural factor actually is a stronger predictor for flying behavior than individual factors. And definitely these results actually show us that while we really need to think about spatial justice when we're really moving everything online, or right away say, well, traveling to conference is definitely a no-no when we're making the policy implementations. Yeah, so mind that all the discussion there before was kind of literature across the academic disciplines. In our survey, we focused on people who are in climate and sustainability environment field. And we asked them, so what factors actually, what are the actual key factors when you're selecting the conferences that you attend? We didn't ask them in person or online, but kind of like general, what is the important factors that you consider when you're attending the conference, when you select the conference? And we can compare that in person versus like online. Actually, we found that it's very consistent, what people have very consistent expectation. In person, 20-something% of the people, so like the first priority is the conference theme. This is kind of like intuitive, the same as like online conference. The second factor is the professional networking. So around 17% of the people select a professional the key factor as the professional networking when they're selecting conference. It kind of like imply that it depends on who are the people they're going to see at the conference, who are the people they're expecting to interact. And these are some of the key factors when our survey respondents say that's the key factor that when they're selecting conferences. These results actually shows that the consistency between in-person and online conference show, well, it seems that people have similar expectation when we're moving things online. So there's some implication of the design that we can think about, and we're going to come back to this point a bit later. But an interesting finding is, well, there are relatively lower percentage of people say carbon emissions is the factors that they're thinking about when selecting conferences. And mind that we're talking about a group of people who are in sustainability and climate environment field. So that's interesting. And whether or not this is actually influence of behavior is a different question, but definitely that hasn't really been a key factors, and it hasn't been really normalized in academic travel, academic conferencing. So all these results for this survey question definitely shows that perhaps rather seeing a virtual hybrid format convening or conferencing as a kind of like compromising solution for in reaction to COVID, for example, or in reaction to the climate crisis, we perhaps have to kind of start differentiating the different purpose between in-person and online conferences. And that definitely poses a question of, well, probably there's some element for in-person convening is important and it cannot be replaced online, but does it really make it necessary for us to meet annually or frequently? That and like for traveling frequently, it's a different questions. And so the next stage of our design studies really start to ask the question of how may technology enhanced mode of interaction allow for more innovative way of working? Can we actually start to thinking about academic work or probably transdisciplinary work a little bit differently, as opposed to now we're having very fixed mindset when we're going to conference for something that we sort of expect to also happen online. And so definitely, can we actually expand or even reimagine these purpose for academic conferences? As an example, when we're talking about sharing kind of like lecture format presentation, does it have to be a flying conferences? Can we do a different sort of like multimedia knowledge dissemination? Actually, perhaps it's more effective and reach more audience. And what does that mean for in-person conferencing? How do we kind of like repurpose it and make it really effective? That's the questions that we will be exploring for the next 2 years for this project. So there's definitely this question of, or assumption, common assumption that, well, like online conference is definitely good because it's more inclusive. And so shifting online is definitely beneficial. But from our sort of, not necessarily experience, but definitely from literature and some of the survey results show that, well, this assumption may not really hold. It's just we experience different challenges. So I'm gonna hand over to an area for this.
Okay, so just to frame our thinking today, so what do we even mean by inclusive? So an inclusive global conference should facilitate the meeting of all relevant stakeholders. So scholars, policymakers, practitioners, we can add youth to this list or local leaders to gather and exchange ideas, regardless of their age, gender, country, or physical abilities. Especially with an international conference, what we want to do is facilitate a worldwide dialogue where everyone can participate and learn from the experience. So there are some common barriers to conference participation for in-person formats. So the big one is cost. So the cost of entry, but then also the cost of travel. So having to pay for your flights and hotels. And beyond that, travel can be a privilege that not everyone has. So some people have an easier time moving around the world. They have the right travel documents, they have the right passport. Also, travel for work can be difficult if you have caring responsibilities. So if you have children at home or older adults that you're responsible for. Language can also be a barrier. So English is the dominant language in these conferences, and that can limit people's ability to participate or even feel comfortable presenting their work if their work is not English first. And then there's also questions of accessibility. So things like, is there a sign language interpreter at the conference? Is the venue wheelchair accessible? So like Elaine said, there is this assumption that when we move online, that because we can all access the conference from our homes, that it is more inclusive. But in reality, we just get some more challenges to face. And the only real thing that gets eliminated is travel, which is good for the environment. There are less emissions, but cost is still a factor, language is a factor, and accessibility. And then we start to encounter connectivity and tech challenges. So not everyone has high-speed internet or even their own personal laptop that is able to stream videos for hours at a time. And then because we've got people joining from all over the world, time zones become a challenge. So like here today, it's 7 a.m. in Montreal, and in Dhaka, it's 5 p.m. So it can be hard to schedule and to find a time that's fair and inclusive for everyone. And then along with that is Zoom fatigue. So this feeling of exhaustion or disconnect that we get when we're trying to make connections and have conversations online. And these three things were also identified in the literature and in our survey. So they're on the forefront of people's minds. So now we're going to move on to how do we address some of these challenges and how do we really put on a great conference from what we've learned so far. So there are some options in virtual conferencing. I'm going to talk about them and some of the pros and cons. So there is the fully virtual option like we are experiencing right now. So it can be asynchronous, so people are not joining at the same time, or it can be synchronous, so it's a live talk like we're doing right now. So the benefits of asynchronous is that the issues of time zones get eliminated, so people can join when it is comfortable for them, and then maybe they can join chat forums and communicate that way. But if we're really trying to facilitate a dialogue amongst people around the world, synchronous really can't be beat for that interaction and engagement. Despite this, our social interactions are weakened in online spaces. So even though a live event might have more face-to-face interaction, it's still difficult to make those social and professional connections. So in the literature, like I said, it's seen as more inclusive and sustainable, the fully virtual option, but there's still more work to be done to really to reach that goal. So the second option is hybrid. So some people are attending in person while other people are attending online. And the tricky part about this is that if you are attending virtually, often you're disadvantaged when creating relationships. You're not physically in the room with people, so it's hard to strike up a conversation and make those connections. And for that reason, usually hybrid events have 2 tiers of pricing. So if you're going to the event in person, it usually costs more. So now we're starting to see all those barriers get recreated. So people who are able to travel or are able to afford the higher cost of entry are able to go in person and make those connections. And then the people online are disadvantaged. So really that doesn't mean that hybrid can't be done well. It's just that in the design, extra efforts have to be made to make sure that the people participating virtually and the people participating in person are able to engage and interact with each other in a way that's really collaborative and inclusive. Another really exciting format that is quite new is a multi-hub format. So this is actually first and foremost an in-person event. They're in-person events held in different locations around the world. And then participants attend each in person at each hub, and then the hubs connect via video conference. So the idea is that it eliminates long distance travel, so people can travel more locally, maybe take a train or drive rather than fly, and get the benefits of an in-person conference and eliminate some of the emissions. So the literature really presents this as the most just and sustainable and exciting option. But instinctively and realistically, the world is a very big place, and how many hubs are really necessary for it truly to be inclusive and prevent people from getting onto a plane? So it's a bit of a challenge. So now some insights from our survey. We asked folks what makes a great conference experience for both an in-person and an online format. And the most important factor for an in-person format was the informal discussion and networking. So people really want to be making those connections and having conversations versus the online, it was only 6%, so it was quite a bit lower. And then for online and hybrid, actually the most important factor was the overall quality of conference sessions and panels. So what we can glean from this is that maybe if you're participating online, you're maybe more interested in the content, whereas in person, you might be more interested in the connections that you can make. The second most important factor was for in-person was also the overall quality of conference sessions. So it's always important that you are learning something, that you're feeling that what you're learning is quality. But then for the second, for online, it was the facilitation of dialogue compared to only about 8% for an in-person format. So what we can take from this is that really facilitating the interaction takes more effort and is more important in an online space. And then finally, just an interesting note that accessibility wasn't very high on the list of things that made a great conference experience. So only 2% for in-person and 5.5% for online. So my instinct about this is that, we conducted a survey online with people who maybe are quite comfortable with accessing the online tools, and maybe accessibility is something that you don't think about if it's not something that directly impacts you. So overall, high quality engaging sessions are key in ensuring a great online conference. Facilitating structured and informal discussion is essential for online conferencing, and creating virtual communities of practice, so a space that people feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves, is really vital, and that can create active engagement. But this area tends to fall short in online conferences, and it's something that we need to work on. So now I'm going to pass it on to Elaine. And I think we are doing a Mentimeter.
So we will share a link in, so this is kind of like a little bit edgy thing for me because we're a small group and then we have no choice but interact with you through like this sort of tool rather than directly shipping to a more intimate discussion or open discussion. So please bear with us. These are the sort of definitely the facilitation aspect of it, designed for a larger group. But we would really like to hear from you instead of like we keep talking here. So having those insights from our survey and also the review, we will really want to know, other than sort of the barriers that you've encountered when engaging in virtual or hybrid format of conferences in the past few years, what is actually the barriers that you've experienced or foresee to growing and sustaining these kind of virtual interaction for long term? So I'm gonna share the link in the chat, but we will also display some of the results from the audience at the same time. And definitely feel free to submit more results, more elements that as you think things come to your mind. Yeah, there are definitely some interesting things coming. For example, the risk-taking definitely is, if my understanding is correct, and please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat with everyone as well. But definitely there's a discussion about in-person kind of interaction, this kind of back and forth discussion seems to give people a sense of safe space that the discussion can be more explorative. And so the risk component of like, I'm going to send a chat message to a person online versus I'm going to just like bump into the person while grabbing a coffee to say, oh, hey, like this is what you're saying at the conference in the presentation, blah, blah, blah. It's sort of like different. And that definitely showed in our survey results that actually majority of people feel comfortable with their technical skill at presenting. However, less comfortable when they were thinking of interacting with people online. And definitely there's some inclusivity issues comes in, for example, the bandwidth problem, missing eye contact, definitely for sure here, I'm feeling it a lot. And there definitely this kind of like concept of VR started to come up a lot in the literature and talking about, can we replace in-person interaction directly with online and just using VR to kind of, you know, see each other's body language. But whether or not this can really have the authentic interaction that we're talking about for in-person convening is still a big challenge. And do we want to wait until the technology is advanced enough and like doing business as usual kind of like air travel is probably not ideal. So that's definitely something to think about when we're talking about design. They're definitely building trust. It's an important component, keep coming up in the literature as well as our survey. And this kind of like sustained person-to-person connection is definitely related to that. Some of the sort of informal interaction, like you feel tired when you're sitting in front of a screen, like after an hour, but then when it's in person, like can be done multiple hours, go for food after, you know, hour sort of like coffee or drinks. That's definitely something, social interaction that people have missed a lot. And some share space feeling, and we're definitely gonna talk about that and later. Definitely this kind of like sense share of community, the membership, and like you feel like you're part of something. It's sort of like this disjointed world when we're just sitting in front of a screen, and then we have like something else happen in our surrounding. And that sort of concentration in the conference environment has been mentioned a lot from our survey results as well, to say, well, I won't be able to concentrate to sit in front of a room like attending online conferences all day, because, you know, somehow there are things happening also. So there are definitely some alternative solution has been discussed a lot. For example, does can university actually dedicating some conference room for online conferences? This kind of question and design start to come up, and definitely worth thinking more deeply about. And definitely spontaneous interaction, that's definitely a big component. Yeah, so I'm going to stop here because definitely there are a lot of like interesting factors that we're thinking about we're gonna carry these forward when we're thinking about the design of Adaptation Future 2023.
Awesome. So drawing from some of the things that you brought up and as well as the literature, I want to offer some practical solutions if you are going to be hosting an online meeting or a conference, and things from the literature that might help you out. So for connectivity and tech challenges, unfortunately, we can't all be like this guy and be super connected and have VR. So some options that you can do to help people connect is offer a pre-conference tech check and orientation. So ensuring that everybody is familiar with the platform and knows what to do when things inevitably go wrong. So having a lot of technical support available to your audience. Also using platforms and technologies that are not overly complicated or heavy. And so what I mean by heavy is that when you are running a program and your laptop fan starts going, so your laptop might be having a hard time supporting the heavy technology. So VR is one that's like this. It's very exciting, it's new, it's slick, but often it's pretty complicated and not everybody's technology can support it. And then for bandwidth, that was mentioned in the word cloud as well, is offer some alternatives to video sharing. So streaming and sharing video can be pretty heavy on the data usage. So instead you can offer transcriptions of video so that people can read and learn that way, chat forums or mobile-based activities. So things that people can join on with their cell phones if their laptop isn't able to support it or they don't have a laptop. Language as well, something you can do is to pre-record the talks with closed captioning in multiple languages. So that allows people to present in their native language and also is more accessible for people who are hard of hearing. Also, simultaneous translation is a great one to be more inclusive. I know at this conference that Gobeshona has offered translation if you request it, which is really cool. And again, transcription is great for people who are hearing impaired or face connectivity issues. And then this is the biggest thing that came up from your answers is this feeling of Zoom fatigue and not having the interaction that you normally would in person. So just keeping that in mind and having shorter sessions and shorter days, acknowledging that it's tough for us to be in front of a screen for 8 hours a day, so plan accordingly. Activities that encourage collaboration, so having people work together to solve a problem or to come up with new things, or the incorporation of the arts. This can also look like doing something off screen, so encouraging people to draw, to dance, to sing, to just sort of disconnect and do something online together. And then also creating a program that offers synchronous and asynchronous features so that you can attend a live talk, but then also watch a short 6-minute video afterwards when you feel more comfortable, and you can match it with your energy levels. And then for time zones, really the best way to solve it is to record talks and keep them on the website and then use the universal time system to manage the time zones. So now we're going to shift and practice what we preach and hopefully have an engaging discussion. So we do have a Padlet with some questions. I'm going to switch to that. So I think Elaine, here, I'll put the link in the chat. So if you're unfamiliar with Padlet, I'm going to give you a little bit of a tour. So there's 2 questions that we have here. We have, what are the most important opportunities offered to us through virtual or hybrid conferencing, and how do we make the most of them? And then we have, when or where should online virtual conferencing be utilized? Where should in-person exchange be retained? So take a minute to think about them. And then when you're ready to respond, you just go over here to this plus, click. Then you can type in a subject. So I'm going to put an opportunity. You can add all kinds of things. So if you wanted to do a drawing, you can put a song. That you absolutely do that, but also you can just write something down. So an opportunity, I'm going to say global perspectives, connections, and then publish. And then it'll just live right here underneath the question, and you can react to other people's answers. So I'm going to leave this up on the screen, but also feel free to just unmute yourselves and we can just have a conversation as well.
If you are wanting to share some experience, just orally, I think you may need to use the raise hand function, but feel free to raise a hand. We're a small enough group that we can probably have time for anybody who wants to contribute their thoughts, their experience, even a highlight of a conference that they had seen as being particularly impactful or particularly successful at this. We'd love to hear your ideas or questions that you are you're grappling with yourselves. Maybe I can chime in to get the ball rolling, and hopefully others will follow up. But certainly, I can relay that it's breakfast time for my 1-year-old out on the other side of the door right now, and so the challenge of being between two places and trying to simultaneously attend to kind of family responsibilities and participate in an engaged way in a conference, especially when in a presenting mode, are very real. And I think that the pandemic, where we've, at least in many parts of the world, have lost access to kind of office space, or are joining, let's say at 7 o'clock in the morning, where our office may not be kind of conveniently accessible to us at odd hours, or 11 o'clock at night, or whatever, are very real experiences that need to be taken into account. And this idea of having kind of dedicated conference kind of hubs or nooks or things in work are certainly interesting to me as we move towards kind of wondering what the office environment is going to look like and kind of serve as a purpose in the next years.
So I'm just going to point out some of the answers on the Padlet so far. So the ability to listen to the recorded session, which does not happen with in-person events, that's true. So sometimes you're just relying on your notes, but having this repository of information that you can revisit is actually a really great opportunity. And then the opportunity for ECRs and or master students to participate and listen to conferences that they would never have been able to attend time-wise and financially. I would definitely relate to that. I'm a graduate student and here I am presenting at a conference in Bangladesh. Like, that probably wouldn't have happened in an in-person format. So it is a really exciting opportunity to connect with people around the world and learn new perspectives. So when there's more than listening to talks, so some conferences offer schedules that include workshops, write shops, training, or collaborative aspects that mean participants are creating things rather than merely watching speakers. Yeah, and admittedly, that was kind of in the back of my mind for this presentation. You were talking about hosting an engaging presentation. What can we all do together so that we work together and it's really actively engaged? And I think doing something creative is really exciting, or having an opportunity to learn, like a workshop. So often project teams combine other activities back to back with conferences and try to make the most of the travel and emissions. So may include trips to the field for research, depending on where the conference is. So being really intentional with, if you are going to be taking a plane making sure that you get the most out of that trip. I guess I'll just keep reading them. I hope anyone feels comfortable jumping in if this was your comment. So opportunity to step beyond what's new. So IPCC Cities 2018 encouraged participants to look forward, focused of based on your experiences to date, what is the future research agenda for your community? This changed the tone of the conference away from here's what we did and found out to more is this is what we still need to know. I think that's a really great example too of creating a community of practice, right? We're all working on it, something together.
And maybe I can chime in on this and say this is something that's come up in our kind of interviews, our one-to-one interviews with people, but less in the literature and less in the survey results, are the sort of asking these questions of what are the tools that maybe we may be afforded to us through virtual conferences that otherwise wouldn't be available, and kind of foresight techniques and scenario building using particular tools, particular processes that allow us to manipulate kind of forward-looking kind of visions and so on and so forth, is an area that where it was highlighted as being potentially really fruitful, but not yet realized in any great way. So perhaps an area of exploration for the future is, are there tools and techniques that could be realized using virtual conferences that we haven't explored sufficiently to date and could benefit a lot from, quite specifically to this community.
So we have a new one. So bring together very diverse stakeholders, assuming they have the bandwidth, et cetera, grassroots leaders interacting in Gobeshona who would unlikely interact and attend some conferences. So yeah, I think the idea that virtual conferences are more inclusive, there is some truth to it. It's just that it has to be done very thoughtfully so that those diverse stakeholders are able to participate. But it does offer that opportunity. Yeah, intentionally uncovering distinct perspectives. I really like that.
Yeah, these are some great suggestions. Thank you all very much for kind of having shared those. Maybe we can see if there's any kind of last chance for any intervention from the floor in terms of questions or contributions that anybody wants to make. Okay.
Okay, so we'll shift over. Okay, and then this is for Elaine.
So definitely a lot of the contribution and thinking is really in line with the insights that we got from literature, and there are definitely more needs to explore further. And that's basically our job in the next 2 years, to sort of see what's next, then what can we do about it with all these kind of insights and experience that we've got in the past few years. So a few areas of focus that we will be looking at, for example, as Glenn was saying earlier about the scenario planning, more also even if we're talking about envisioning process, can we actually expand our motivation and purpose of academic conferences and really find different benefits from in-person convening and online convening, and to really create a low carbon format of an alternative. So when we're thinking of just moving everything online, it doesn't mean that we're translating all the in-person activities directly online, but can we actually sort of think of different scenarios, even to test it out and see, does it make sense to do it online or in person? And definitely a major component that it's really important, and we keep kind of reiterated this point of inclusivity and diversity and equity. That's definitely hasn't been seen a lot in the literature, but it has been come up a lot in the discussion. And we really want to sort of like almost test it out, those assumed inclusivities we've talked a lot about, for example, time zone, and also the assumption that staying at home, be able to see video is more inclusive. But then is it actually true when we're talking about, for example, the internet bandwidth, and also the time and the concentration time a person can have in the institution that you're located or at home that you're at. So those kind of like assumed inclusivity hasn't been really experimented or hasn't been really explored. There's also a very important component of the perspectives from the global south when we're talking about planning the conference together. So as we're moving things more to online kind of formatting, there's a lot of assumption about how people interact and what are the format or dominant format of interaction that hasn't been really discussed in the global kind of sense. So a lot of assumption about, for example, we will assume people can directly interact very actively. It's not necessarily a thing, actively online, it's not necessarily a thing across the globe. So how can we actually include those perspectives in the planning process? It's something, an area that we're also going to focus on. And definitely the academic culture, for example, there's an example on the recording, and some conference organizer may be actually discouraging this sort of like recording practice because the sense of, I don't know, like in person is more expensive. So we want the best experience for in-person convening. That sort of like academic culture and also discourse really kind of bring up the awareness of, well, we cannot do this. This is really unsustainable practice that we're meeting annually just to sit in a hotel, having a cocktail in our hand and talk about intellectual knowledge. And definitely there are more and more higher education institutions are going to impose the policy on like limiting air travel because more universities are actually committed to reducing their carbon emission to net zero by 2050. So even though academics perhaps are not aware of it, but definitely changes are coming. So how do we actually shift the norm, institutional norm and policy to be more in line with sort of like international network to research collaboration while be able to really incentivize the practice of decarbonizing academic work? And here we're talking about not necessarily only conferencing, but definitely related to like collaboration, even sometimes like international teaching, for example. Those are the things that we really have to think about to create incentive structures and also the policy sort of like design to not penalize people who are, for example, doing having work in one country and actually doing international work in another country. So these are some area of consideration that it's going to we're going to explore in the next 2 years for our design research, and definitely we've been talking a lot. So Ariel is going to give a few takeaway, like what we can do right away next.
Yeah, so coming back to that guiding question that we started the presentation with, so how do we make low carbon climate and sustainability conferencing practices just, inclusive, and impactful? So know your audience. So understand that individuals have diverse needs and motivations for participating in conferences, and try to anticipate those needs and address them. And then understanding that inclusivity is not necessarily improved when we move online. So understanding how the accessibility issues shift and evolve in the different formats, whether it's hybrid, in person, or virtual. Really something that is coming out is that facilitation is key. So facilitation is the most important thing to a great online conference experience, and try to make the online experience human. You know, that's a big ask, it's challenging, but try to think of different ways to engage people beyond just the screen. Also, careful planning and active facilitation to encourage dialogues enhances the conference experience. So people want to talk to each other, people want to collaborate, but understand that sometimes it's more difficult, so it takes careful planning and facilitation to get there. And then finally, we need a cultural shift. So we need to reimagine the possibilities for virtual conferencing. We don't want to just replicate the in-person conference experience online. Imagine going beyond that and doing something more exciting or different. And avoid going back to normal. This is something we hear a lot as we kind of shift out of the pandemic. I'm not sure if that's happening, but avoid going back to normal, because incorporate the lessons learned and the opportunities presented by virtual formats. So take this as a chance to change business as usual and to try out some new exciting things. So now we're going to open the floor, just have a discussion. We have this question that we were hoping to hear your perspectives on. So whose voices have been missing from traditional conferencing? Who do we think is not here that we would like to see? And how do we include them? But also any other questions that come to mind, anything that you feel like you'd like to talk about or popped up as we talk today. The floor is yours.
Feel free to type into the chat or to use the raise hand function if you'd like to chime in on any of these questions or on maybe some of the work that you're doing or experiences you've had. Maybe I can chime in on one of them while we wait for somebody else to intervene. And speaking specifically to the whose voices have been missing, and I think one of the ones that really kind of challenges me is in now working in a faculty of education, but also thinking about climate change, is the voice of youth. And we've tended to, those of us who've been attending climate conferences for a while, have token youth representatives. So one or two outstanding figurehead youths who give a 5-minute speech and are ushered off to the sidelines for the rest of the event to continue as planned. I think this underestimates the contributions that youth can make, but it's also, I think, due to the fact that we have remained stuck in a very traditional model of academic exchange and discourse around these issues that have closed out youth by virtue of the formats that we've been using. So perhaps one important thing to be thinking about is how could youth be engaged, and what would it mean for us to rethink what conferencing and convening looks like, to have something that is actually youth kind of embracing or youth accommodating beyond kind of tokenistic participation. What does that look like, and how do we kind of make space for that? And what maybe does it invite us to do differently to kind of use different parts of our mind as participants? So that stands out for me.
That makes me think, you know, the challenge of people navigating different contexts, you know, that they're attending a conference in their home and that maybe they have their kids with them, and it can be difficult to manage all of that. Imagining if there were workshops or events that invited kids to be a part of it, that might be an opportunity to bring youth in, but then also help parents navigate those two things.
Bruce raising a useful point here in terms of the shift in mindset around what conferences look like, and seeing them as a waypoint in a process. Not just the destination in themselves. So thinking about this as being an integral kind of stopping point in a longer journey that we're taking collectively as a community, and how do we then kind of realize that as a sort of a very different agenda. Sorry, I think we had Lucia joining to speak out.
I didn't quite. No, I just saw that there was a button to press, so I pressed it. But so I actually, because it changed the format, I missed your point. But maybe just to say what I was thinking is, yeah, I think this idea, and I haven't had a chance to read what Bruce wrote, but this idea of really rethinking conferences, and it comes back to your open floor question about who is missing. I think, and this also ties a little bit to something that Bruce mentioned yesterday about Claire thinking about action labs. I think what we need is more dialogues, and perhaps more informal dialogues, where we really bring different stakeholders together to discuss like some burning issues. So, I mean, of course, at a global level, it becomes very challenging because we can't, I think, have very productive discussions that are context specific at a global level. But I wonder if, the idea of conferences was thought about again, and they become more decentralized, like lots of small dialogues where we are still sharing results of research, but still hearing the knowledge, from the practitioners on the ground, from the local government technician, the agricultural extension office, from the communities, and really make it much more problem and solutions oriented. So, I mean, this, of course, is completely perhaps different from what academic conferences are normally used for. I think it's a forum to share research and results and to network in the academic level. But I think maybe also what is needed is these like much more decentralized dialogues that are seeking to really respond to problems. And so I think maybe there is a way to think about it, like this idea is not refined at all, but that would bring together these different types of people who will never attend an academic conference, but also because what will they get out of it? They don't want to come and listen to people's research. They're coming because they have a problem and they want to seek a solution. So what forum is there actually for them, these types of either government stakeholders or practitioners, communities, to go to and find people who will want to share and help them find these solutions.
Can I jump in? I really like this idea, and it's definitely sort of some kind of connecting to what Bruce was saying in the chat about intentionally building this like COP beforehand, even afterwards. And that kind of concept of conference or like membership of association to organize conference, does it really make sense in the direction the academic research is moving now? It's kind of a big question, at least so far in my mind. It was like, well, this kind of paywall system, does it still make sense when we're really, especially in the field of like sustainability and international development, like we're talking about a lot of transdisciplinary collaboration, really working with different stakeholders and having those sort of like model that it's like back dated so many decades ago. Does it still make sense? And can we use this opportunity to really rethink those mechanisms to enforce a community like that? Yeah.
Maybe I can also chime in on Lucia's point on two fronts. One, Lucia, you highlight that it's not what academic conferencing used to be about, and I think maybe that's a good invitation, is to say, well, maybe this is not about just changing formats. Maybe it's about changing purpose, because maybe knowledge transfer, which I think is what much academic conferencing has been kind of traditionally about, is something that's actually achieved in other formats equally. We have social media, we have so many other platforms for knowledge transfer, which weren't afforded to us back when conferencing kind of first arose, but now are perhaps our primary modes of being kind of receivers of new knowledge. And the second is about this sort of like being brought kind of face to face with challenges in situ, like in their kind of in that place where they're being experienced, not prepackaged into a kind of a journal article and pre-analyzed, but actually kind of authentically embedded. And those who have been to, for example, the community-based adaptation conference series recognize the sort of field trip dimension and experiential dimensions of conferences, in-person conferences, being so critical. We've reflected on, to some level in our initial thinking, about whether virtual field trips that use multimedia kind of tools could be a kind of a midway point to bring more of those kind of in-person experiences and those firsthand experiences to life. But maybe there is a point in here about sort of going back to what we had on the Jamboard of the authenticity of actually kind of physically gathering around kind of authentic challenges and understanding kind of firsthand what those challenges really look like, have a transformative dimension to our learning that may be kind of irreplaceable. Even the best documentary does not necessarily kind of give us the sense of what it's like to see, a community that's experiencing persistent flooding and having to kind of cope and innovate on the fly with kind of response mechanisms. I think here, we're, I guess, presenting in Bangladesh in theory, and some of that experience and the learning and transformation that could be attached to it is in many ways, I think, irreplaceable for some of us. But it does involve, as Lucia is putting in the comments here, local stakeholders who are able to share that in kind of quite authentic ways, and not just having a kind of a researcher kind of carry that experience with them to present on behalf of communities, perhaps.
Well, perhaps I can use my presenter privilege to sort of, because I personally have been thinking about this question, and perhaps there is sort of issue that around what we've been talking about is really not about comparing carbon emission from the past or with other group, but versus what is the sort of concept of value for emissions. Does it actually bring the value that beyond traditional conferencing, or even more, having different sort of, for example, early career researchers opportunity to represent, field trip for different stakeholders to be able to sort of connect, and that sort of value for emission kind of question keep come up in my mind. I'm just gonna throw the idea there and see what people think.
Maybe here we can leave the floor open for final interventions before we wrap up. This was the closing dialogue that we had planned here. So just any last interventions that folks may want to make, and we'd be happy to kind of hear your thoughts.
Maybe just to respond to Elaine's point, I mean, it sounds on one hand like, oh, we think we have all the solutions, but on the other hand, it may be true, especially if you make some of these like conferences or bringing together stakeholders very solutions oriented. In a way, it does add value to the fact that people have traveled, and so it is not it is not such a passive or extractive process. It's also contributing to something, to perhaps solutions and so on. So I think, maybe, I mean, I think the idea of these small dialogues is, perhaps too far-fetched, but perhaps conference organizers maybe should have, as part of request for attending the conference, that participants come and solve a problem of, how could we involve the public around that area, say in Montreal for Adaptation Future? Okay, let's discuss the problem of homelessness, or let's discuss the problem of, I mean, I don't know the problems in Montreal, but I'm sure there are many, as in other places. So why doesn't the conference also become a hub to contribute solutions with all this international expertise coming in to the problem, so that everybody has contributed something beyond just attending? So perhaps it's something else that could be experimented with.
I love the idea. Just kind of very quick comment.
Some great ideas, and both from the Padlet and the kind of the chat box, as well as Lucia for kind of stepping up and bringing some things into the dialogue. Maybe with that, I think there's been some really great exchange. We'd like to thank IDRC and MyTax for the funding and support for the undertaking of this research, to recognize our partner Ouranos, who are collaborators on both the organization of the Adaptation Futures Conference, as well as the research that has informed this presentation. As noted, this is a work in progress. This is a kind of a multi-year journey that we're on, that will take us into 2024 even. And we invite you to kind of stay engaged. You can reach out to us. You'll see our email addresses, our social media accounts, if you'd like to engage further on this, to share experiences, or to get involved in kind of next steps of some of this work. Do be in touch, and we look forward to sharing kind of results and innovations and lessons learned as we move forward. So yeah, with that, thank you all so much for your participation, and please do enjoy the rest of your day, wherever you are and whatever time it may be where you are.